A house that has seen habitation over well over 1,000 years will pick up vibrations. I know the scientists will scoff at this and say, oh, you can't prove this. But something I think rubs off, and I'm very alive to the vibrations that old buildings and old churchyards or old bridle paths give, which have been the scene of human activity going back years and years and years and years. Well, some people have had funny experiences with their dogs, which, if taken off the lead, will suddenly, in terror, race off, frightened, by something that they feel but we haven't seen. And that's happened quite a few times. My name is Anton Bantock. I live in Withywood, and I've been a teacher in Bristol for about 30 years. This is Ashton Court. It's Bristol's stately home, a huge mansion with a very long and interesting history. There were people living here in Roman times. In fact, there's a mosaic Roman pavement just in front of the west door. People walk over it, they don't realize. Certainly there was a Saxon hall here from about the 6th or 7th century. And the Great Hall, as it is now, is exactly the same dimensions as that Saxon hall well over 1,000 years. So it's gone through many, many changes. It became a manor house, it became a castle, it became a grand mansion in the 18th and 19th centuries, and it is now owned by the city of Bristol and is used for conferences and weddings. There are all sorts of stories connected with the Smyths of Ashton Court, going back to the time of the Spanish Armada, to the Great Civil War. The Smyth family were incredibly rich. They were probably the 3rd richest family in the west of England, and certainly in the top 10 in the whole country. Looking around Ashton Court, you might say 150 years ago that everything you could see, as far as Dundry, as far as Bedminster Down, everything you could see belonged to the Smyths. Even the coal underneath Bedminster. The male line failed more than once. When it failed in the 1830s, an impostor appeared claiming to be an unrecorded son and heir of one of the previous Smyth family. Well, he put up a very good show, and he claimed to have wills and relics and heirlooms all to prove that he was a genuine member of the family. But he turned out to be the son of a Warminster carpenter who'd been married for a short while to one of the maidservants at Ashton Court, from whom he'd gleaned a lot of family information. And he was an out-and-out rogue. He sort of passed himself off as a member of the Smyth family. And eventually he was exposed, and the court fell about laughing, because his final stand was when he said, well, I've got proof that I'm a member of the Smyth family, because all male members are born with a pigtail. And he turned his back on the court and fished the pigtail out from underneath his coat. And of course everyone fell about laughing. That was in the time of Greville Upton, who then changed his name by royal licence to Smyth and became a baron of the 3rd creation. And he really was the last great owner of Ashton Court from about 1836 through to his death in 1901. Most people have heard of the very beautiful woman he married. It was his own cousin, actually. Her name was Emily Way. And Emily was one of those well, she was a lesser Helen of Troy. She had this alabaster complexion, eyes like emeralds, no, not emeralds, sapphires, and hair like spun gold. Men swooned on the sight. She was married off young because she had an impediment. She had some sort of childhood illness which caused her to limp. And so she was rushed into a loveless marriage with a wealthy banker, George Oldham Edwards of Redland Court. However, her cousin, Greville Upton, now Greville Smyth, who was a very bashful young man, never quite had the courage to declare his feelings for Emily. And the most unrequited love affair developed between him and Mrs. Edwards, as she now was, which went on, I suppose, for about nearly over 20 years. Now, the two children born to her, no one has ever cast any doubts about the paternity of her son, although it was rather odd that he should be called Greville Edwards. It was known that she admired her cousin. But for the daughter, who's also recorded in Burke's Peerage and the other official lists as Esme Edwards, the daughter of George Oldham and Emily Edwards of Redland Court, members of the family whom I have tracked down and servants, old retainers, etc., swear to the paternity of Esme being Greville Upton, and was born to Emily when she was still married to George Oldham Edwards. Well, George Oldham Edwards eventually died. He was old enough to be Emily's father, if not grandfather. That was in 1883. And after a really very short interval, Emily and Greville were married. They were then over 50. It was a fashionable wedding in St. George's, Hanover Square. And they moved into a completely refurbished and Victorianised Ashton Court. The central courtyard had been roofed in to make a winter garden. Miles of new carpeting had been put down. Walls covered with appropriate allegorical prints and shields and assegais from the Zulu War. Bamboo furniture, Canterbury whatnots, the full panoply of Victorian bric-a-brac. When Greville died, Emily inherited everything and was the Grand Lady of Ashton Court for the Edwardian period, and that represents, I suppose, the last great age. It was a time of industrial troubles, which of course meant the closure of the coal fields that brought a lot of the money, depression in agriculture, and again that reduced the rents, Lord George and super tax and death duties and tax on land values, all these aimed a mortal blow at big estates like this. There were the servant problems and then the First World War. Emily didn't survive that. She died of pneumonia in November 1914, and her daughter by Greville, who had now married Gilbert Irby, came into a very mixed blessing of an inheritance. £1 million had to be paid in death duties. She handed the house over to the Red Cross for a while, and it was a convalescent hospital for wounded officers. But she wasn't really able to live here until the middle of the 1930s, and by this time she was quite an old lady. And she continued to live here right down to 1946, when she died here. And the last years, of course, the household was very, very much reduced. There had been 30 indoor servants in the time of her mother. Now it was about 12 or 10. Whole wings were closed down, were no longer habitable. Rain came through the roof, and her life contracted to about 2 rooms. And her company was mostly her pets. I mean, at the bottom of the lawn here, you will see the necropolis, the graveyard of all Esme's dogs. The New Town and Country Planning Act of the then Labour government more or less placed a sort of compulsory purchase order on large open spaces like this, and it was acquired providentially for the city of Bristol as its lung, as its place for activities like here today. And the house fell into more and more ruin until eventually the city bought that as well, round about 1959. And I think the price was something like £78,000. I mean, we couldn't buy a two-bedroom house for that these days. Unfortunately, the treasures of 400 years were sold to pay death duties in a gigantic sale around about 1947. In the mid-70s, the City Council made the very courageous decision to spend £2 million of ratepayers' money making the building at least weatherproof. So it had a new roof, and collapsing walls and floors were taken out, but it's left the building virtually gutted. Ashton Court survived by the narrowest of margins. In the 1950s, 10 mansions the size of Ashton Court were demolished every month for 5 years. I mean, that just shows, you know, the loss in those years. Ghost stories, loads of them. There's the re-sightings of the third Sir John. Now, the third Sir John was a rather sinister character, a misanthropic bachelor who died about 1849 in rather horrific circumstances. He was found dead in bed with an expression of real terror on his face, and there's a slight suspicion that his two widowed sisters, Florence Upton and Mary Way, might have helped him on his way with a little poison, because they were very anxious to secure the estate for their offspring, whom they conveniently married to each other. And of course the result was Greville Smyth, whose parents were cousins and whose grandparents were cousins. Anyway, this Sir John, the third Sir John, who died in 1849, okay, he was a successful businessman. He developed the Bedminster National Vale coalfield. He built the 5-mile wall round the park. He built 3 of the gatehouses. He bred pedigree cattle. And he chose for his companions some pretty ferocious bloodhounds. And his enemies said that the reason why he shunned human companionship was that he was suffering from some offensive ailment that caused him to smell very badly. Well, I think that was just malicious gossip. Certainly his relatives were terrified of him, especially his young nephews and nieces, because when they made their dutiful visits, if they misbehaved, the butler was summoned and they were dangled out of the window in the dark over the yard where these bloodhounds were braying in the yard below, because that's how you disciplined children in those days. Anyway, so Sir John has been sighted. He's been sighted looking in, wearing this sort of stovepipe top hat and a frock coat through a little window in the library. And then he's been heard driving a coach and four over invisible roads at the top of the park. The carriage wheels can be heard crunching gravel, nothing seen, but just the sound of this carriage careering through the darkness. And once, the housekeeper's daughter, Queenie Froud, returning with her father from the pantomime, this is round about 1910, moonlight night, they came to a 5-bar gate at the top of the park, and there was Sir John leaning on the gate, grinning at them, and little Queenie screamed. And her father was very much taken aback and later said, the apparition retreated backwards, slowly, sinking at the same time into the ground until it was just a grinning skull. Terrifying experience. In fact, I drew a picture of it and we published it in the Spies of Ashton Court, little Queenie screaming and the retreating skull. Secret passages, hidden treasure. Ashton Court has stories about this, almost certainly going back to the Civil War. The family treasure was concealed for fear that it might fall into the hands of the parliamentarians. So there we are, look. Queenie screaming her father and this apparition turning into a skull. In case you want to buy this book, which is still available, page 4. Oh yes, and treasure was thought to have been hidden. Well, searches were mounted over and over again, especially by the Honourable Mrs. Esme Smyth, who was very interested in her family history, and as an old lady went into it in some detail and organised search parties and dug up the park and went into some of the big plantations at the top here, and there were all kinds of clues, but nothing was ever found. However, she read in one of the family documents that one of her ancestors had been buried wearing a very, very valuable ring. And she was determined to get this ring back. So she had the Smyth vault underneath the chancel in Long Ashton Church opened up. And somebody went down and sort of rummaged through the sort of splintered coffins and decomposing corpses, but no ring was found. The truth is that round about 1820, a really horrible character called Bristol Joey, who was a grave robber. I don't think he plundered graves as the body snatchers did. He was out for gain. Anyway, he broke into the Smyth vault and ransacked it, caused absolute chaos, turning over graves and tipping out bodies, looking for treasure. And this is well reported in the local press, and it caused a sort of a frisson, a shiver through the spines of all the then Smyth family, who hastened to have the Smyth vault sealed up permanently so that couldn't ever happen again. And I suppose were it possible to get inside, you would find very little. In fact, there's a lady in the state of Maine in New England who keeps writing to me saying, "Oh, could you find for me the grave of Ferdinando Gorges, who married one of the Smyth heiresses way back in the early 17th century. And Ferdinando Gorges, in fact, founded the state of Maine when it was called New Somersetshire. And I said, well, he's there down in the vault, but no one can now get in. And, well, I mean, she's a very forthright American lady, and I reckon she'll be over here and going to the city council and saying, I want to open that vault. I don't think she'll find anything. To me, it's a terrible shame that the city council is so concerned to make money out of it that the place is almost continuously used by people who want to have weddings there or hold conferences there, and the public can't go in, and there's lots to see.